Welcome, everybody, to the Sapien podcast. Very, very excited to have my guest, Mr. Brian Sachetta, on. I was going to say doctor. I do have a lot of doctors on, but Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no worries, Gary. Thanks for having me. And yeah, not a doctor. Definitely want to stress that, but glad to be here.
But you have a very interesting background, and I actually want to start with that. I was listening to your podcast. I checked out your book. We'll get into that. But Brian's an author. He has two books out. He's a health coach, a mental health coach, and has an interesting background as a business degree and an engineer, a computer engineer. I wanted to bring that up because what I've noticed as I've gotten into the podcast space and sort of talking with more people outside of the traditional Western medicine system, a lot of engineers, people with like analytical minds, people that look at systems instead of like just data, right? Because we all know that evidence-based medicine, research studies, they're great, but there's limitations to that stuff, right? We know that a lot of, it's very easy for them to do a study that's inconvenient and get rid of it or whatever. Like there's a lot of issues that I've talked about in this podcast ad nauseum, but what I've noticed is it's the engineers, it's the people with analytical systems-based approaches that end up making meaningful impacts in sort of the outside of traditional medicine space because they see the problems and they see solutions and they see different angles. And I think you're just a perfect example of someone who is not a healthcare person, but saw a huge problem and has a dramatically unique approach to it. I don't know. Do you see yourself that way? Is that how you came to be this sort of mental health guru, for a lack of a better word?
Well, thank you for all of that. And what I would say is it's a good way of looking at it. I don't know if I necessarily put that same spin on it, but it's refreshing to hear you say it. So here's how I think about that idea as it bounces off of me, right? I think of it as, and I think there's some cool things to dive into here. Other topics you talk about on your podcast and whatnot is like I remember being 18 and then 23 and 25 and all those different mental health struggles that I went through, right? And I know a lot of doctors, I know a lot of people who work in the medical industry, like they're all great people. They work really hard. They want to help people. I don't think the system, and I'm not trying to go too wide here. I'm just saying, like, as somebody who has dealt with anxiety, as somebody who's dealt with depression, like, let's be honest, like the solutions that are given to you are not that great, right? Like, if you think about the amount of time the average psychiatrist has, it's like you see them for like 48 minutes a week. Maybe they give you a prescription. Sure, the prescription can be really helpful. Talking to them can be really helpful. But what all I know is I did that stuff when I was 18 and when I was 20 and all that. And that didn't really get me to where I wanted to go. So the engineering piece or the sort of scientific piece, whatever you want to call it, is I I think of it as like, okay, if I am a software engineer or, a computer person, whatever, I look on a daily basis, I look at problems and I'm like, how do I solve these things? So I sort of took my own personal experience of like, I've been through mental health struggles. And on top of that, like I've had a hard time figuring out like through the normal system, figuring out a solution for myself. And here I am in, my 9 to 5 job, constantly solving problems, thinking things through, being analytical, kind of like putting those two things together and being like, if I'm an engineer and I want to know how things tick, and I also want to then know like how I can provide solutions to those various problems that I come across in my day job. And then I have this problem outside of work in the mental health space. Like, why don't I try to put those two things together and see where I get? And I'm not saying that I have perfect answers or anything like that. But what I will definitely say is there's a lot of people out there that are like, the current paradigm does not work for me, right? Sometimes drugs work, sometimes they don't. Sometimes talk therapy works, sometimes it doesn't. A lot of people are looking for additional answers. All I'm trying to do is supplement what is already there with some sort of like battle tested knowledge, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting. Get Out of Your Head is the title of your first book, and then you did volume two. And for those of you listening, definitely check them out. First one, it focuses toolkit for anxiety, and then the second one, I know you tackle depression. I didn't obviously read them. I did go through some of your blogs, which are also great, and I noted some fun topics. So I think it's a good place to start. Like, when you introduce your book to people, I'm sure you have a sort of a spiel on like the toolkit. I obviously have a lot of tools that I present that I consider lifestyle medicine, right? Behavioral, daily habits, things you can do that don't really cost money to manage your health. Obviously, that mind-body connection. We're so like-minded. I saw you had a whole blog about that. Can you talk to me a little bit about this toolkit for anxiety?
For sure. So, how I like to put it and how I like to talk about the first book in general is so I'll just state the title and that'll help me kind of, get my feet in line or whatever. So the first book is called Get Out of Your Head, a Toolkit for Living with and Overcoming Anxiety. And that was basically the product of me going through my own anxious episodes for about 10 years, right? Having that struggle of being like, I'm going to see the psychiatrist. And yes, it's helpful to be in the doctor's office and talk to that person, but like, what am I going to do when I am literally in the trenches, 5 hours a day, 6 days a week, 7 days a week, whatever it is? Like, how am I supposed to handle myself? How am I supposed to carry myself when I'm not in the office, when I'm like, I am in the thick of it right now? So, what I did was like, I said to again, this is sort of just me being an engineer, being like, I have to create a solution for myself. It was sort of like a white knuckle battle of, 10 years to try to figure this thing out, come up with some tactics that I can then use during these episodes, right? To get myself out of those anxious states. That is sort of like, in a nutshell, that is the book. But the book is also two parts, right? So I talk about in the first part of the book, it's more of, I call it like zooming into anxiety, right? So it's like if you are already anxious, you're feeling that way, what are some things you can do right now to walk that fear back, to not feel that way, to not feel as anxious in the moment? The second half of the book is sort of a larger picture of like, okay, we've already talked about how do you feel less anxiety in the moment. The next part is how do you get into fewer of those anxiety provoking situations in the first place? So that book is sort of like I was trying to, I wrote it, oh man, 8 years ago, I think. I was trying to just, it was almost like an encyclopedia, almost, if you will, or an anthology. I mean that in not a literal sense whatsoever. It's like, hey, here is everything that I have learned over the last 10 years of me dealing with my own anxiety. I'm now serving it up in, something of an artistic fashion to the reader in hopes that they can then, let's, I guess, bring that word toolkit back in, that they can go through all the content that I provide and say to themselves, ooh, these 5 tactics are interesting. These 3 lifestyle habits are also interesting. I'm going to create my own toolkit, my own tool belt. That way, the next time that I'm in an anxiety provoking situation, I can take out the tools that resonate with me and are pertinent to the specific situation that I find myself in to walk that fear back, as Brian had kind of suggested, right?
It's so interesting because I describe all the stuff that I do as having a toolbox, and I just pull out different tools. And every year that I'm a doctor, my toolkit gets deeper and I have more tools. And more, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, they're non-traditional tools, or what's considered traditional. Again, alternative medicine is the word, but it's not, right? It's just things that aren't, you know, traditional pharmacological drugs or, um, you know, just well, and here's the other point about it. The problem with mental health management as it is today is it's not an approach that's like holistic with toolkit of like breathing techniques. Basically you go to the psychiatrist, you get a diagnosis, and then they start trying different drugs on you. And then, people think that the psychiatrist knows something. And I'm not trying to poo-poo psychiatry. What I'm saying is we don't really understand how most of the psychotropic drugs really even work. We pool them into classes like SSRIs, SNRIs, atypical antipsychotics, blah, 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 neuroleptics, but like really, they don't know. And me personally, I watched really smart psychiatrists practice it, and I saw different strategies and I asked questions. And so I've got in my mind sort of an idea of how to manage different things based on my colleagues. But it's not taught in med school necessarily. There's no magic formula like, oh, this patient with these things gets that drug. It's a little bit of like, this doctor likes to use this drug, or this doctor likes to use that drug, or for these kind of patients, I like this. It really is like personal physician preference a lot of the time. And then what it's never is what you're talking about, which is toolkit for how to actually deal with things. Because what the psychiatrist says is, I did my thing. I'm gonna refer you to a psychologist. And then you're doing psychotherapy or something like that. And I feel that it's one, the access to that is very difficult. It's very costly, lack of insurance support for it. A lot of people dealing with real mental health stuff don't have a lot of money. And even if they do, they don't know how to navigate to these really special people that can give them this toolkit. So I think it's so important for, for you to put something out like this, because it's simple stuff. I know it's simple stuff, and I want to ask you about some of those things, but it's the simple things that we forgot about when we got married to Western medicine, 80 to 100 years ago. We just forgot about all the simple things. In fact, we deleted them for the most part. And now, as we have a pandemic of mental health disorders, depression, anxiety, agoraphobia, eating disorders, you know, it's for anyone listening, if you're dealing with this stuff, it's more than common. It's ubiquitous. It's every single patient. Everyone's talking about anxiety. Everyone's talking about depression. I ask myself sometimes, is it almost like so popular that people are jumping on it, like calling it that so that they could give themselves an out for not going to the gym or not eating right because they're anxious or they're depressed? I don't know. It's just so ubiquitous that it's it's everyone. And so I really focus on trying to keep people off medication, because most of the meds don't do much and the side effects are nasty. And if you can just build a toolkit like what you teach your readers, you can probably manage this stuff without a lot of pharmacology. Maybe a little bit of help, an occasional SSRI or an occasional benzo when you're really having a panic attack. Like, there's a role for pharmacology, but it cannot be the first line therapy like it is. And that's why everyone's so sick. Um, Talk to me about some of your tools. I don't want to take the bloom off the rose. I want people to go get that book and really dive into it. But if you had to pick like the top three, and this is, I'm just curious because I have my stuff too. If you had to pick like the top three habits or strategies that resonate with readers and you hear back from people, what would those be?
Yes, great question. I am definitely going to answer it. I just want to like kind of put a coda on what you said there, right? This this whole field, this whole subject is very nebulous and kind of new, if you will, right? I think let's let's hope that humanity gets, in the future, 100, 1,000 years, whatever, there will be some point in time where we look back and we say, wow, the way that we used to practice made no sense. It was something akin to like bloodletting. You know what I mean? And why I say that is like there are very few other industries. Like if you're in traditional medicine, right, and somebody has something wrong with their kidney, you look at the kidney, right? You do scans. If somebody is having problems with anxiety and depression, nobody's doing an fMRI to see what's going on in your brain. You know what I mean? And to figure out like how do you react to certain things, right? So it's
Is it
expensive,
even
it's
in the
difficult.
brain? Is it even in the brain? Is it a problem with your gut? Is it a problem with habits? So
Exactly. So I do think that in the future, hopefully, as these technologies get less expensive and whatnot, we'll be able to turn this from a black box into something that we can figure out more information about, and then we can be more targeted in our approaches. Right. The reason that what really came up, why that really came up, was when you said, we throw an SSRI at it, we throw an antipsychotic at it, or something like that. And I'm really not trying to belittle what the doctors are doing, but we're kind of just guessing. You know what I mean? We're not saying here is exactly what's going on in that brain, and here is a drug that is going to target that specific thing. We're just like, oh, there's a collection of symptoms here based on this collection. My gut or my research says that this should help or could help, right? So it's difficult. Getting into the actual, okay, what are the tactics that work for people, right? I'm an engineer. I'm sort of like a scientist in a way. I use that term super loosely, like just a layperson scientist, right? Like I enjoy finding evidence, using that evidence to support some conclusions that I'm trying to draw. And so I'm always looking at things like evolutionary psychology. How did the brain get the way that it is, right? And so if you want to, like, I think anytime that you're talking about anxiety, I mean, also depression, but let's start with anxiety, right? You have to go back to like, where does anxiety stem from in the brain and in the body? Why does it exist? A lot of people will quickly say it's sort of a survival mechanism, right? So if you flash back to 100,000 years ago, our ancestors being on the savannah, and there's a tiger in front of that person, they need to run away from that tiger as quickly as possible to find safety. If they don't run away, they might need to fight the thing, but obviously fighting a tiger is difficult. The logic kind of goes that, if you were not able to fight with or flee from that tiger, you were probably lunch meat, right? So over time, evolutionary psychology would suggest, and this is not news to you, but just kind of laying the theory out there, would suggest that like essentially we were incentivized. This was a behavioral trait that a lot of us had, and we were incentivized to fight with or run from these scary predators and menacing threats in our environment. And those that didn't have the ability to detect danger very quickly and run away from it or fight with it, again, they became lunch meat, right? So then you fast forward all the way through to today, and you say we still have these very primitive mechanisms inside of us that say, hey, that is something that's scary in front of me, sound the alarms, right? And it's sort of like, I guess I'll bring in some of the computer science stuff here. It's more like a 0 to 1 gate than it is a spectrum. So it's a lot of people will often say this, they'll kind of cite this thing called the smoke detector theory. And they'll say the smoke detector theory is the notion that inside the brain, inside the body, when it detects something that could be scary, could be threatening, the alarms inside of us are going to ring out whether that thing is actually a life or death threat or just possibly maybe an inconvenience, right? Because the idea is if we don't sound those alarms and then that threat actually becomes a life or death threat and it kills us, it's like, maybe we should have sounded the alarm, right? So kind of rounding this all out, we say, where are we today? We still have these primitive mechanisms in our bodies that are constantly saying, fear, 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 run away, run away, run away. The difficulty is we're not actually in front of real lions and tigers today. We are in front of metaphorical ones that live on our cell phones and our computers and on our calendars. And so these mechanisms are still running, right? And the real challenge is you could be inside, your office, right? You could be at your company and you're having a company meeting and that mechanism starts firing. And it's like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, as if you're going to die and there is a tiger that wants to rip your head off. In reality, right? Not saying that what is happening in that meeting isn't a little scary, isn't, possibly going to affect your job or anything like that, but it's not actually that life or death threat most of the time, 99.999% of the time. So the difficulty that we have these days is we have these mechanisms running and they're blaring out all the time. And yet it's really hard for us to do anything about these things because it's like, there is a proverbial tiger on my calendar a month from now. I can't fight that thing. I can't run from it, right? And so what I would say is anxiety is basically a product of these mechanisms that we have in our body that are designed to do something other than what we want to get them to do in this day and age. And so what we're left with is all this fear with the inability to do all that much about it. And that gets me into some of the tactics, I guess, if I could to give you three quick ones, right?
Because you just brought up something. We're gonna get to the tactics.
Sure.
But to add to what you're saying, it's not just that these triggers for the anxiety aren't necessarily life-threatening anymore. The other problem is that people online, companies, and the government know this, and they prey on people's fears. There's a lot of fear mongering, and this happens in the medical community too. A small piece of information that may or may not be super relevant is amplified to create fear, often to drive uh, sales or behaviors that are lucrative for someone or something, right? And so it's not even just that we don't live in the savannah anymore and these mechanisms are not super useful when it's a meeting or like your example is, but really that other entities and organizations are preying on those fears. They're amplifying them. they're not educating the public like, hey, let's really look at what's really important. Instead, let me scare you so that you buy this thing or sign up for this program. And that's a real problem because people are getting overwhelmed with information and they don't even know what is actually scary, because one day it's COVID and the next day it's this other thing in the news media, and all of that is a brain meltdown that you have no tools to battle, because this whole social media online overwhelming of information is new. It's just like a decade old, and we're not teaching young people how to manage these fears. Just wanted to add that because it's a sad truth that has been amplified in the last 5 years.
It's a very sad truth. It's also a really great thing to call out, right? People are manipulating us and creating this really stressful world, right? I will often say to people, to kind of go on top of what you had just mentioned, is my philosophy, and everybody is different, but I'm like, I don't watch the news because I feel like the net of it is not positive, right? I'm like, I understand that these news networks are businesses, right? And they are designed, as you were saying, to drive this fear to get you hooked on the screen, right? They need eyeballs on the screen, they need clicks, they need views, that sort of thing. Sadly, a story, like a heartwarming story about a cat that was pulled out of a tree, doesn't really drive those clicks and views in the same way that those scary stories that really hit those mechanisms inside our brains do. And so it's a yeah, it's a little bit of hijacking, a little bit of manipulation, but we really do have to be careful because it's like we can find ourselves very quickly without even realizing it in a very stressful state, in a very stressful world environment. And then it becomes really hard to decipher what's going on because you basically become, I guess a good analogy, and it's kind of crude, would be like sometimes people say, I've been wading through feces for so long that I can't smell it anymore. And that's kind of the problem there, is like you're in this toxic environment with so much stress that you just live in it and you can't even see that that is the problem because you've been there for so long.
And that's why people are turning to podcasts and books and looking away from traditional recommendations, because the recommendations are not updated, they're not sophisticated, and they're not adapting to this modern stressful environment that we're creating. And I just a small example is like stepping away from mental health entirely. We're cholesterol, right? Eggs. We'll go even specific, eggs. I can't tell you how many patients I've had that come in and someone tells them they have high cholesterol and they're like afraid to eat eggs. And it's a real thing. They're like scared because go on CNN or whatever, and there's like some real scary articles about it. They don't post the articles of the study that looked at every research paper on eggs, like a review, and said, there's no correlation. And in fact, cholesterol is probably not that dangerous. That information is out there. It just doesn't get clicks. It's also not advantageous to the food companies that are marketing on these channels. So the scary thing gets posted because it gets all the clicks. The non-scary resolution to that idea, right? Because sometimes we think one thing and we find out something else. That doesn't get put on the headlines. That gets buried or not posted at all. And so then there's all these fears that are amplified. And then even if we resolve those fears, like the COVID thing, which was very scary, and then later we found out was not so scary, they never went back and then pacified everyone and said, you know what, guys, it's been years. We have more information now. We don't need to be so nervous. This is just a part of our world. It sure was scary, but we've got it. We understand it now. There's none of that. I still have people coming into my office right now talking about stuff from 2020 that was disproven in 2021, and it's 2025. Is it 2025? Yeah. And they've not been updated on it. They've been walking around 3, 4 years still in this constant state of fear. And I got patients walking in right now afraid to eat eggs because some doctor said they were going to die from an LDL of 100, which is not the way it works. And man, we are up against it. We are up against it, Brian.
Yeah, it's I get the feeling that we could talk about all this stuff for a really long time. How I can cap this in a succinct way would be to say no matter the subject, you want to look at where the interests are, right? So if somebody is creating a problem for you and then also is purporting to sell you the solution, you might not always be able to suss that out, but you want to be careful of that. If they're like, "Hey, here's my $1,000 magic pill thing," it's like, yeah, that's a problem, right? That's a conflict of interest, if you will. And I think I would also say, just to add on the food thing, right, is like, have we really gotten to a place where, and I mean, we have, but like, have we really gotten to a place where like the FDA is like, Lucky Charms are healthier than foods that have been eaten for hundreds of thousands of years, right? That's when you really need to start thinking for yourself and being like, okay, where does the data lie, right? When I say bring in the evidence, I'm like, what makes more sense? A food that came onto the market 30 years ago and then diseases start to skyrocket, or a food that like it's an animal. People have eaten it for, forever, for eons. And, unfortunately, it's like you don't see, pigs in the wild dying of high cholesterol and heart disease and heart attacks. I guess I'm going to stop and get off my soapbox there. But yeah, we do have to be very careful about the information that is served to us and figure out who is benefiting from it, right? Talking about the mental health stuff, it's like, I'm just a dude who's been through some of these challenges before. It would be awesome to make money off of these books. But at the end of the day, my interests are aligned with helping people who are going through the same struggle because I know how real that struggle is, how difficult it can be. And, it's like, sure, if I really had to put a value on some of the books, it's like, think about all the other things that people do. They go, they get psychotropic drugs, they go to therapy. I'm not telling folks to replace any of the content that I write with that stuff. But if, they're willing to shell out a lot of money for those services, then like, hey, a $10 book, I think that's a good value.
Absolutely. So I think anxiety is something that every single person on this planet, you know, is dealing with right now. It's, I don't know, maybe some people that are not online and stuff, maybe they found a balance, but everyone I know deals with anxiety, including myself. And I had during medical school a difficult journey with that because I put a lot of pressure on myself to perform, and I wasn't prepared. I wasn't prepared for dealing with that anxiety. So, what are the top three sort of modalities? And I don't want to, again, I don't want to go into all of them. So just give us like some highlights, and I'm curious where what you've heard as far as feedback on your book.
For sure. So three quick ones, or three ones that I think will give some good bang for the buck. So I gave that preamble on evolutionary psychology, the primitive mechanisms of fight or flight in the body, right? Why I give that preamble is to say, if anxiety stems from that mechanism, then what is happening is, when you're afraid, when you're anxious, those mechanisms are blaring out and you need to get them to quiet down somehow, right? Now, this is sort of more like, again, in the moment strategy, because it's like, yeah, if I'm already feeling fearful, like I got to turn that fight or flight mechanism off, or I got to try to get it to power down a little bit. So all the things that I'm going to talk about right now are geared toward that. Just a little bit of a disclaimer. So the first one being, right, you think about that mechanism and what that mechanism is designed to get you to do. It's designed to get you to move your body, right? You're in front of that tiger and it's like, oh man, like I better run for my life. Otherwise, I'm going to die. That mechanism still runs inside of us. It is still secreting the same hormones. We've got cortisol and adrenaline coursing through our veins, sending us signals and saying, Gary, Brian, run. And yet what we do is, and I do this too, so I'm not judging. We sit on our couch and we sweat through our t-shirts, right? And what that really results in is these hormones just continuing to course through our bloodstreams rather than us using them as temporary spurts of energy to, get us moving, get the signals to go away, and then be back to homeostasis, if you will. So that's really the first one. And the reason that like it's challenging these days to implement, actually, right? Because it's like, if you are in that meeting at the office, it's a little awkward to be like, I need to get up and I need to go run around the block. But if you are actually about to go into a panic attack or something like that, you might want to say, what would be better, or what would be worse? Would it be better that I have a panic attack right now in front of all my colleagues, or that I look a little awkward and I get up I go out onto the street, nobody in my office knows I'm out there, and I come back in 5 minutes, right? You just take a little mental health break. Let me just pause there. We can obviously talk about tips 2 and 3, but I just want to see if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I love that angle because exercise is one of these things that everyone talks about all the time. But I wrote down when you were saying it, even before you said it, run, because it links up to this evolutionary biological perspective. Your body is telling you to run. It's telling you to act. And if you just like actually listen to your body and exert that energy and express it in a healthy way, which is exercise, whether that is a run, which we're going to say run in quotes, or go lift or go do some standing squats in your office, just do like 30 squats with no weight just to like get your heart rate up. And when you take control of your autonomic nervous system by exerting your body, you get to control it's control of a part of your nervous system that you don't have control of. So autonomic nervous system is the part of your body. There's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic side. It happens automatically, right? Like your body, you get inputs and your body pushes out hormones to sort of drive a flight or fight or a rest and digest process. So I say embrace it. And that's what you're saying, embrace it. If your body's telling you to fight or flight, go for a run. Go do something that feels like that, and then your body will go, okay, got you. We did it. Actually, there's no tiger. We're gonna chill. And so that's what I would add to it is it's actually if they're hacking our nervous system to make us anxious, then let's listen to it and give our nervous system what it needs, and then you will find balance again.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I guess I would just add for listeners, right? This isn't to say go for a 30-minute run every time that you feel a little anxious. It's like it could be as simple as Gary said, do a couple squats in your office, run 300 feet, right? Just get that heart rate up, get your body moving, try to clear those stress hormones that are coursing through your bloodstream for sure.
What else you got?
Okay, so very closely related to that one is the idea of doing some deep breathing. And so what I want to talk about here that I haven't necessarily said explicitly, even though you just talked about it, right, is the divisions of the nervous system. So we have that autonomic nervous system, like what you said, Gary. It controls processes that happen automatically. So we don't have to think about our digestion, right? It happens on its own. Same thing for, heart rate for the most part. We're not sitting there pushing a button, telling our heart rate to go a certain speed. If you look at the autonomic nervous system, you break it down into those two parts that you just talked about. You have the sympathetic nervous system, aka fight or flight. You have the parasympathetic nervous system, aka rest and digest. And so you can think of sympathetic, parasympathetic as like a tug of war or seesaw kind of thing, right? And it's like there are times where we're really stressed out. There are times where we're really relaxed. And there are other times where we're somewhere in between. When we're very anxious, the sympathetic nervous system is revved up pretty high, right? And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get that parasympathetic response to activate a little bit and bring us back toward calm. Scientifically speaking, and I couldn't exactly tell you why it works this way, but scientifically speaking, when you do deep breathing, you get that parasympathetic activation. Specifically, when you breathe in, your heart rate increases a little bit, so you get a little bit of a sympathetic activation. And then when you breathe out fully, you get a parasympathetic activation, so your heart rate slows back down. One other thing to add here, right, is like you think about the way that anxiety works and the fight or flight mechanism works, and you say, okay, I am in front of a tiger right now. When the sympathetic nervous system comes online, it has really one goal, and that is to help you survive, right? It is not to help you think critically. It is not to help you turn things over in your mind and be analytical. There's no time to be like, hey, Mr. Tiger, what's your name? Where's your family? What do you like for breakfast? You got to get the heck out of there. What that means for us is that when we're in that anxious state, it's very hard to think clearly, which then means it's also very hard to pull out other steps out of your toolkit and say, I'm going to implement this one next. You're just like, I need to survive, right? So when you're doing that deep breathing, not only are you calming yourself back down through the parasympathetic activation, but you are also bringing the mechanisms inside your brain back online that allow you to think a little bit more deeply, critically, analytically, clearly, all that stuff, right? So the reason why I talk about breathing, even though it is simple, is it really is kind of one of those first steps. It allows you to get your body back in a physiological state that then allows you to say to yourself, hey, I actually have a toolkit. I remember that now. And because I remember that and I can think about it and I'm not totally crazed, let me think about what step I am going to enlist next. Let's pause there and see if you got anything.
Um, well, the scientific mechanism of deep breathing is important because you're manipulating your acid-base chemistry when you're breathing. Your body, you're inhaling oxygen, you're blowing off CO2. When you're anxious and you're not taking deep breaths, you're building up CO2 in your lungs. When you blow, when you take deep breaths and you're blowing out, you're actually taking off that acid from your body. And so it actually affects your neurochemistry by manipulating your acid base balance in your body. And that is the way we can affect our neurochemistry. And part of like the running, when you run around the block, you're going to have to deep breathe and you're going to oxygenate your cells and oxygenate your brain, which is good. And you're going to blow off CO2 and create more balance in your acid base chemistry. And that's going to release hormones that help you calm down. And that's very, very simple. And most famously, it would be remiss not to mention Wim Hof, because there is a gentleman who, for the last 20 years, has been beating this drum. I mean, he couldn't beat it any more loudly. He got famous as the Iceman because he would go and spend, do mile walks, many miles, like I think in like 20-mile walks in the cold, and is able to control his temperature. And he's like in shorts and like no shoes, and that became famous, and that was on all the news media and blah 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 blah. But it actually misses the point. The fact that he can hang out in the cold, that's amazing because he can actually control his temperature regulation with his breath and with his mind. So it's an example of controlling your autonomic nervous system uh, with behavior. But it's funny, he got famous for the part that's not as important. It's not important to survive in the Arctic tundra with your shorts on. No one cares about that. We have clothes and no one's doing that, right? But what he's really doing is he went through a tragic event in his life. I think he lost his wife. It was really, really sad. He got super depressed and he's like, well, how am I going to do this? I don't want drugs. And he discovered the power of breath. I mean, this has been in the world of yoga and the world in plant medicine and traditional, all sorts of traditional medicine therapies and modalities use breath. Breath is life-giving, and it's a way for us to change our neurochemistry. And it's so basic. We forget to breathe. Going like this is not breathing. That's called having a panic attack because you can't actually take a deep breath and you can't expel that CO2 that's building up and you can't oxygenate your lungs doing small breaths. So there is various strategies. Wim Hof just has one very simple one, but box breathing, and there's a whole world of people that teach you different breathing things. Even there's some cool ones where they use a straw and it makes it really, really challenging. And it's a world of healing that exists by just manipulating the breath. So it's foundational to our health to understand deep breathing strategies.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think, I again going back to the evolutionary psychology stuff and, the little side chats we had about food and all that, I like to think about, okay, scientifically speaking, in terms of the evidence that I have in front of me, in terms of history, is like, what tools do we have at our disposal that are the oldest, that work the best, right? And it's like there was a point in time where all we had were our bodies and our breath and our different senses, right? And so it's like clearly we back at that time we needed to be able to regulate ourselves as well. And so clearly like there was something inside our bodies that allowed us to do that. I'd say exercise was a great one and breathing had to be another one. We didn't have, let's say some of the calming apps that we have these days. We didn't have technology, so always good to think about some of those older modalities that have been around for a long time. Because usually it means I forget if it's the Limby effect. There's some term I'm looking for where they say The longer something sticks around, the longer it is likely to continue to stick around. It's sort of been time tested at that point. So you want to jump into maybe the last tactic? So I had some ideas as to what we might talk about, but we've been going down this chain. So I kind of want to continue that, and I think this will make sense and kind of round us out nicely. So in the first half of my book, I have these 10 steps, which I call the 10 steps to getting out of your head. Just a simple framework that people can try on for size, maybe take a few of these different tactics, put them into their own toolkit, and then use them when they are feeling anxious to, again, like I've said in the past, walk some of that fear back, right? To feel a little bit less anxious in the moment. So, specifically, step number 2 is determine the true importance of what's making you anxious. And the sad thing about these steps is on the surface, they sound like so obvious, but it's when we start talking about them a little bit deeper that I think they make more sense and have a larger impact. So, why I wanted to talk about this one was we already discussed this notion of the smoke detector theory, right? So as a recap, we basically said, the body essentially wants to sound the alarms because if the threat in front of us, even if it doesn't look menacing right now, if it turns out to be something that kills us, in hindsight, hey, maybe we should have, blared the alarms. So there is some tipping point in our bodies, in our brains, where all of a sudden we say subconsciously, oh, gotta sound those alarms because this could be something that could potentially be threatening, right? The difficulty with that is you then get this whole host of things, like a wide range of stimuli that vary all the way from like barely threatening all the way down to life or death threatening, right? And they all have that same effect on us of causing that alarm to sound. And I keep using that term, but in a concrete sense, what does that mean? That means feeling anxious. That means having your palms sweat, having your heart race, having tunnel vision, maybe having a bit of a stomach ache or butterflies in your stomach. All the sensations that and associate with anxiety. And so the biggest challenge anxiety is a large challenge. There's many, but one of the largest challenges associated with anxiety is we can kind of get fixated on the smoke detector rather than the stimuli, right? So we say to ourselves, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, I'm feeling anxious again. I feel like I'm going to die. And the challenge with that is because we have such a large range of stimuli that can evoke that response within us and then get us to turn away from that stimuli, we can often forget, and this is, just a little caveat here. This is not me saying that, this is not me downplaying anything that a reader or a listener is going through. This is not trying to make light of those things. It's just saying that a really common pattern in anxiety is having a stimulus scare you really bad, turning away from that stimulus and focusing on the anxiety itself and losing sight of what it is that scared you in the first place. And so when I talk about this step in the book, what I say is think of it as if it were actually a smoke detector in your house. Is the thing that you're dealing with, so once we've already, moved our bodies and got our breath going and got sort of the analytical skills back online and we have that wherewithal, ask yourself, is the fact that my alarms are blaring out right now, is that indicative of, say, like me blowing a candle out in the wrong part of my house? Or is it more indicative of my house being completely engulfed in flames, right? The difficulty with a smoke detector is that in both of those situations, the alarm is going to go off. Now, obviously, not all the time can we say to ourselves, like, hey, this is nothing and I'm going to move on from it. But a lot of the times we can. And so when we make that inference, we say, look, hey, this is scary, but this is not the end of the world. We then allow ourselves to, it's almost like we're giving ourselves permission to not be as anxious as we were previously. And obviously, there will be times where there are really threatening and scary things in front of us. This method doesn't apply in those scenarios, but it's fascinating because I find myself doing this all the time where I'm like, oh my God, I get that scary thing coming up, yada, yada, yada. And then I say to myself, okay, so what if it goes horribly? Like, who cares? And I don't mean that of every scenario, but I'm saying in a lot of scenarios, I'm like, okay, if that goes horribly, there'll be another opportunity next week or in a month or something like that, and I'm going to move on. Being able to reconnect to that stimulus and not just be engulfed by the anxiety, that's a really, really important and critical skill to cultivate.
And that's why, and I think speaking to this one is a great point because that's why therapy and talk therapy, and there's some great, resources like BetterHelp and these online places where you talk to someone. I think that's that processing of what these stimuli are, what you're actually afraid of. If you do that work, if you actually sit there and analyze and discuss and talk about what is bothering you, you can start identifying that, hey, when I actually have a meeting, I'm actually feeling anxiety from something that happened in my childhood. That it's triggering this like memory or this feeling that I grew up with. And so doing the therapy and talking it through and working on it constantly allows you in the moment to have a more analytical mind and a better understanding of these triggers. And that's the most powerful tool. It's just to actually understand. So, eh, we keep saying that, oh, it doesn't minimize. No one's trying to minimize anything. But also, sometimes you're really anxious about something completely different, or you're triggered by something and then it runs away from you. And without understanding that, having that, like intra intrapersonal knowledge, right? So understanding yourself where you came from and what bothers you and what might trigger you gives you this power in the moment to say, you know what, that person was really rude. They're not a threat, but it triggers this part of me from my childhood. And because I know that, I'm gonna go like, journal, or I'm gonna go for that run or do my breathing and all these different tools, because I'm aware that this isn't a real threat. It's a perceived threat. And it might be a threat, but it's not one worth ruining your day over because you don't actually understand what's happening to you. So it's this under process of learning about yourself so that in the moment you have more insight and you have more control. This discussion about anxiety is so important. I'm curious now because we don't have time to get into volume two where you talk about depression, but I want to know what your perspective on it is because I have my own and I can lead, you tell me, but I have in my mind, anxiety and depression are two sides of the same coin. They're not actually different things. I'll do it. I'll just say my theory. And I didn't come up with this. I just do a lot of reading and I don't even remember where I read it, but this made a lot of sense to me. Um, Anxiety is fixating, being stuck in your head about the future. Because your worry and anxiety is about things that will happen to you. Depression is being stuck in your head and ruminating on things that have happened to you. It's the past. It's things that you wish you did different or you wish didn't happen to you. And then sort of calmness and balance is living in the moment. And the reality is you will always worry about the future and you will always feel sad about things that happened in the past. That's just life. But doing work to be able to bring yourself to the present is how I like to teach people to think about this because the drugs for anxiety and depression are the same drugs. The modalities, they're very similar. I'm sure you get into nuance, but they're very, very similar because ultimately they're the same process, just depending on where your brain is fixated. It's stuck in the future, it's stuck in the past. And I worry with the technology that people are not in the present. They're so looking at something that is either echoing the past or worrying them about the future that they're not actually in the moment. They're just staring at a screen and that screen is taking them somewhere else except here. Is that a way you think about it, or do you have a different take on this?
I have a slightly different take on it. I don't discount anything that you said. I think it's wise. I would say that depression is basically a pervasive state of helplessness and hopelessness, right? A lot of times people will equate it to, I believe it's Martin Seligman ran a study with these dogs and basically showed that there are times where if let's I'm going to mess this up, but basically, you kind of put these dogs in a cage, you get them to push a button. Normally the button can like stop them from getting shocked. At a certain point, they make it so that the button does nothing, right? Eventually, those dogs lay down and take it, right? In what is called learned helplessness. And so I equate, and I think a lot of people do, this isn't necessarily my own idea, depression to a state of learned helplessness, but also hopelessness, right? Is saying, so I look at depression not as just the past, because obviously something horrible can happen. You could lose somebody that you love and be depressed over that, but you could also be depressed over your current state of affairs or where you think they may go from there. There's also like a framework, I think Aaron Beck came up with I want to say the negative triad, aka I think it's called Beck's cognitive triad, something like that. And his logic says that, triad being, three-part framework, saying that if you hold beliefs about yourself, the world, and the future that are negative, you're probably going to experience some level of depression. And I think to me, all of that makes sense, right? So again, just as you could experience depression over the loss of a loved one, you could say to yourself, I'm stuck in a crappy job. There's no prospects for the future. Things are not going to get better. I don't see my life going in the direction that I want it to. Even though those things have not yet played out, you're saying to yourself, like, oh man, like I should just act as one of Seligman's dogs. I should lay down, take it, and die. And the I'm not going to say cure, but one of the things that can be very helpful in depression is recultivating a sense of agency, right? Because agency is kind of the opposite of helplessness. If you're helpless, you're like, there's nothing that I can do to change this situation. But when you bring agency back into the fold, and it's not that simple to just be like, hey, agency, I'm just going to go buy you off the shelf. But when you recultivate that sense, you're like, look, I'm the one steering the frickin' ship. And if I regain that mindset, then I am, I'm kind of back in a state of saying to myself, like, I'm the one in control here. Maybe not 100%, but it is up to me where my life goes. Sure, I'm pushing some buttons and the shocks are not necessarily stopping, but that doesn't mean that the world is designed against me to say that every button that I push is going to keep leading to these shocks. So you kind of just have to keep turning over stones without losing, your sense of optimism that at some point things are going to start tipping back in your favor.
So is toxic positivity good or bad?
Toxic positivity is bad. Obviously, like most of my strategies and just the way I talk, it's mostly middle ground, right? Toxic positivity is way too far to one direction. Helplessness is way too far in the other direction. So, the agency piece is more being grounded in the middle and saying, look, like I understand, like, given the fact that I'm depressed right now, I understand that life can be tough and things cannot go my way. At the same time, I'm not going to let life beat me down into a pulp. I'm going to say, I think that I am capable of getting back to where I want to go. I'm not actually going to set up all these unrealistic expectations for myself that toxic positivity serves up because, let's be honest, right? That's actually not a good place to be either, because what happens is those expectations lead to vast disappointments when you're like, I'm going to be a multimillionaire and I'm going to have all these attractive women, attached to my hip and whatnot. At some point you wake up and you're like, oh goodness, like, I have a big gap between what I thought the world was going to be like and what my current situation is. So it's sort of more reframing your life, coming up with a semi-realistic set of goals for yourself and saying, I believe in myself to, no matter how long it takes, to keep pushing forward and eventually achieving these things.
Very smart way to look at it. And I think it's just important to have these conversations, like just to, you know, why did I even want to talk to you? Because these talks are important, because we don't talk about it enough. There was decades ago where men didn't talk about this stuff at all. And now it's very different. But one thing's for sure, there is no silver bullet for depression or anxiety. There's no end. You're not done being anxious. You're not done being depressed. It's sort of the yin and yang. Like you're always going to have to battle these feelings. And it's all about building skills to be able to manage them and not depending on pharmaceuticals. They're a tool. They're just another tool. And I envision this huge belt of all these tools. And like pharmaceuticals is just one of like dozens and dozens of tools. And we don't sell people the tools. We just sell them one of these tools. And that's sad. And that's, I think, where you're coming from. And I also want to say before we run out of time, I think it's fun, your branding and your website. Please go check it out. Is it getoutofyourhead.com?
That's
That
correct. And thanks for the plug.
well, it's cool because, you know, everyone's got a picture of like a flower, like a, I don't know, like people smiling and like trying to sell you this like idea of like happiness when it comes to mental health. But your approach is more almost aggressive, almost like let's go, like let's do. And I like that. I like that. I think you need to approach this stuff with some sense of motivation and excitement, and like we can do this, it is doable, and we're going to do it, and we're just going to get after it. And that's the energy I get from your content and the branding. And I think it's an important one because I think men especially will connect with it. Men really suffer and oftentimes are overlooked in the world of mental health. We're seeing a lot of changes with that. Women, since the invent of social media, it's a disaster for young teenage girls. Maybe your approach will connect with some of them. Instead of always just selling them flowers and bunnies, maybe they need to see a snake and some fangs and like, let's go, let's solve this problem, It's different strokes for different folks, and there's a lot of folks suffering. So I commend you for what you do. We can keep talking, but I actually want people to check you out. You have some great podcasts out there. You have a really great blog. I'm excited. I'm going to order these books. I'm going to share them with my patients. I think so many of them would benefit from it. So I thank you for what you do. Before we wrap up, is there anything you wanted to kind of guide people to, how they can reach you, how could they can get your book, anything like that?
Well, I mean, you did mention the website, so thanks for doing that. That's getoutofyourhead.com. No dashes, underscores, anything like that. You could definitely reach out to me through the website. Also connect with me on Instagram. The handle there for now is Get Out of Your Head. Again, no dashes, spaces, underscores, whatever. I usually wrap these talks up by, just kind of giving a message of solidarity. When you talked about the brand, like obviously it feels good that like the message that I'm trying to put out there is one that feels like it's hitting with folks, right? And that the identity is reaching folks like yourself. One of the things that I really wanted to convey with the brand was not only the let's go feeling, the aggressiveness, but also like an understanding that like we're not going to sugarcoat this stuff and we're not going to let it hide in the shadows anymore. Obviously, dealing with mental health issues is beyond difficult at times. And again, none of what I say is trying to make light of it or anything like that. It's not to be like, oh, go face your biggest demons or anything like that. But it's to say this is part of life. There's a snake in probably everybody's mind, right? And rather than constantly run away from that snake and, look at a rainbow, sometimes we just have to look at the snake and deal with it. And it's not a sexy look at it, deal with it kind of thing. It's I'm doing this difficult work because I know that at some point I'm going to feel better. And when I feel better, I'm going to enjoy life more. There's a lot of people out there suffering in the shadows. My heart goes out to them. I do obviously neither of us wants to hear that that's happening, but we know it's a reality. So to those that are listening, my heart goes out to you. I hope that you know that things can get better. They often do. If I can be of help or assistance, please let me know. I assume Gary, same thing for you. So yeah, just want to leave that with listeners.
Beautiful. We're here for you guys. That's the message. So with that, thank you for your time, Brian. Thank you everyone for listening, and goodbye.